Hi, AP students. We are going to talk about a new graph today referred to as the Phillips curve. So you're on your Unit 5 guided notes. You're kind of down on page 3 here. I separated the previous section with this stuff. Okay, so that's where we're at, which this is our fourth of five main graphs that you need to know for the AP exam, which, again, getting excited. We're getting close to kind of the end of our content. So anyway, the short run Phillips curve is kind of a review, but we have not applied it to a graph yet. Okay, so the short run Phillips curve is going to show us our relationship between unemployment and inflation. So just real quick here, what our curve is going to look like, just like anything else, we have two axes. Okay, remember our y-axis always has something to do with pricing, inflation in this case. Okay, so a little bit different, and then we're going to put unemployment down here. And our Phillips curve is going to look like that. Okay, now we're going to call this our short run Phillips curve, SRPC, and then our long run Phillips curve is going to be straight up and down, very similar to our long run aggregate supply. Because if you remember our long run aggregate supply, we can also apply that employment, statistic on that bottom there, and we're going to put a percentage on this unemployment down here. Okay, so again, we're always going to have this, this frictional unemployment that's going to be supposedly like 5% or so, right, where we can label that. And they'll give you a number to label that, sometimes 5%, 7%, whatever. Okay, so what we need to know, normal circumstances, there's a short run trade-off. Long run, remember when we start shifting those long run and I'm sorry, the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand graphs, based on if our government doesn't get involved and we start getting lower wages or higher wages, and that affects our supply curve. That's that idea that eventually it shifts back. Just to give you a quick little diagram, right? Eventually that supply curve shifts back and we get back to that point, right? And this is our long run, this is our long run equilibrium there. We're always getting back to that point. Okay, so anyway, we're going to make it make some sense here as we see what we're talking about. We're going to talk about shifting some of these things. It's a pretty straightforward concept if you know what we are trying to show with our graphs, and you know what our graphs are labeled as. Okay, let's start off here. We're going to start out with both our Phillips curve graph. Okay, so we're going to say our short run Phillips curve and our long run. Okay, and this is our unemployment down here. Axis. All right, here's our inflation. Now remember, inflation is going to go from hypothetically 0 to 100%, right? So it's going to do that. And then we've got over here, we've got our long run. We've got our long run macroeconomic graph, right? So we're going to draw this. We're going to do this. All right, so we got long run, aggregate supply, short run, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We got our price level, which sounds a lot like what? Price level and inflation, right? We can use these axes against each other. Okay, so keep that in mind as we kind of say, okay, let's not get too confused with what's going on. If you remember, we also talked about real GDP being down here. We also remember calling it employment, right? Didn't call it unemployment. That doesn't make sense. As we move to the right, remember our employment's going to go to 100. Our unemployment is going to go to 0, right? Vice versa on the other side. Our employment is going to go to 0. Our unemployment is going to go to 100. Okay. So our aggregate demand shifts, okay, are going to cause one of two things. I'm going to change how I draw this here real quick. I'm going to put us in long run equilibrium. Okay. It's going to change our statistics. So let's first of all create an expansionary policy. Okay. So our expansionary policy is, and we're going to say that we were at, down here, we're going to say 95% employment, which means what? 5% unemployment. Okay, so when we're at this long run equilibrium here, we're at this Phillips curve equilibrium here. Okay, and we're just going to call inflation, let's just call it 5% And we can call it the same thing on our price level over here, 5%. We can label it as a percent if we wanted to. All right. So let's just say that we have a expansionary policy. So we're going to increase our aggregate demand. I'm going to label it with an ADE for expansion in this particular case. All right. Now, this creates a new price level. Let's just call that 10% inflation. Okay. And let's label 10% inflation over here. This expansionary policy is also going to increase our employment rate. Let's call it 98%. Okay, which means what for over here? That means we're going to be at 2% unemployment over here. Don't forget, we're mixing what we're showing, right? If you can tie that together, you're going to be in good shape. Notice 10% here, 98%. Well, that's 2% in reality, right? Unemployment rate. You can see that we're going to match up on our graph right there. Okay, so that is when we shift our demand curve. Okay, we move along the Phillips curve. Okay, so we shift over here, we go over there. You don't have to remember that though if you can remember what the graphs look like. Okay, you can always cheat your way to an answer. Let's flip it over and check our work here for the contractionary side. Let's just assume that we have a decrease in, a contractionary policy. So I'm going to call it AD, lowercase c there. All right, so here's our new point. Let's call inflation in this case 3%. Unemployment though goes to 92. Employment drops to 92%, which means what? Over here we're at 3%, right? And over here our unemployment rate gets to 8%. Okay, so here's our new point. This is contractionary. This up here is expansionary. And you can also show that if, let's say, that somebody were to ask you if you wanted to show expansionary policy, what that would do on a Phillips curve, you could draw this dot right here. Draw it to the left of the long run Phillips curve. Contractionary would be to the right of the long run Phillips curve, which again, we know what's going to happen in these cases. Employment in a contractionary situation, unemployment's going to go up, inflation is going to go down. So we just need to be able to draw that relationship in relationship to that long run Phillips curve. Our long run Phillips curve is going to represent our full employment rate, which again, we called 95% in this particular case, 5% unemployment. Okay, let's see what happens when we shift our short run aggregate supply curve here. Things change a little bit differently. Go ahead and start yourself off. Get yourself a set of axes. I'm going to do the same thing, okay? Here's my Phillips curve. And I'm just going to keep my short run Phillips curve here this time. I'm just going to draw that only. We're going to shift it. All right. And then I am going to put all of our stuff over here. I'm going to give myself my long run aggregate supply. Make sure I get all that. Those are supposed to be intersecting. All right, price level, GDP, and also employment, right? Okay, so that's a Y. All right, let's just kind of start off here and try to label these so we kind of know what we're saying. So anytime that I get somebody saying something, I'm going to label this with a green right here. I'm going to do this, even though it really doesn't play a role. Our long run Phillips curve never moves, by the way. All right, so we're going to call that 5% once again. So this is 95. We're going to call this 5%, just a nice round number. We're going to call this 5% right there. Okay. Now, let's decrease our short run aggregate supply here. So when we do that, let's think about what happens. Okay, so I'm going to say SRAS due to decrease. I'll call it a D. We're up here. Okay, we have a big problem. Our employment rate, let's say, drops to 90%. We also have prices go up. Let's call that 10%, right? So think about what's happening here when we decrease our supply. Prices go up, unemployment also goes up. Big problem for the government. They can only fix one. Okay, so how can we draw that on our graph? Well, let's draw a 10% here, inflation. Let's also draw a 10% unemployment. Well, we've got to find a line that goes through this dot right here, right? How can we get there? Well, we're never going to change the slope of our short run Phillips curve either in this case. So we're just going to say that we're going to shift our short run aggregate supply, or I'm sorry, our short run Phillips curve in the opposite direction of what our short run aggregate supply does. Okay, so that's what we want to be able to show. When we have a short run aggregate supply shift, we're going to shift our Phillips curve in the opposite direction. Okay, now eventually, right, just to kind of get ahead a little bit, we could obviously start trying to increase our demand this way. Well, what happens when we increase our demand that way? Well, inflation becomes a bigger problem, but it does get us back to our employment, right? So we could say, well, we'll eventually shift right back this way. We could do that if we wanted to. That's kind of next level stuff. We don't need to get to that particular point. I'm just trying to go kind of the next step so you can wrap your head around the movement a little bit better. Okay, let's have an increase in aggregate supply. Maybe we have cheap fuel, SRAS increase, get inflation down to 3%, get employment to 98%. Again, let's flip these things over here. Here's 2% unemployment. Here's 3% inflation. So we have this dot right here. Well, we got to have a line that goes right there, right? So that's our short run Phillips curve in that particular case. So again, is it a lot of stuff to memorize? Well, yeah, if you try to memorize all this stuff that's over here, that's talking about, hey, this is what happens in this case, this is what happens in this case. But if you take 15 minutes and wrap your head around these graphs, I'm telling you that you'll be able to draw what they want you to draw. Okay, so that's how those two things relate to each other. Throughout history, they've measured this with what's called the misery index. You may or may not need to know that term. I don't really think that you do, where it adds the inflation and unemployment together. It's just a little bit of a different way to measure what economies are doing. If you were to hear that term, you could know what that is talking about. Hope this is starting to make sense. Some assignments that we'll get out to you will hopefully help reinforce some of this stuff, and we'll talk soon. Okay, for our next unit.